Okay, I am now live on Instagram. Jody Fisher from the PR podcast. Jody,
Hey, how are you, Molly?
hi. We did it.
Can you believe it?
I can't because not 4 minutes ago I was in my kitchen making my crock-pot garlic chicken.
Too funny.
Okay.
That
Yeah.
sounds good. If I wasn't like 4 hours away, I'd come see you.
Oh, well, do you have the same weather that I have right now? Are you in
It's yeah,
nor'easter territory?
it's like we can't see anything. There's all rain and everything. Yeah,
Yes. It's been
yeah.
a nightmare. My poor dog is staring at me the whole time. It is a crisis for people who need to walk their dogs. But I was so happy that you recommended let's just hop on a live and talk about the Alec Baldwin and Dave Chappelle. Like you and I were going back and forth on Twitter,
Yeah.
and you mindfully said, let's just go on Instagram.
Why not, right? And I'm coming to you from my office. Normally, I'm in the PR garage, but I actually have an office. Can you believe it?
I like the office. I like it. Looks great, Jody.
My big geek energy hanging on the wall behind me. But yeah,
Okay.
I listened to your podcast this morning. You were talking about Baldwin,
Thank you very
and
much.
then all the Chappelle stuff is right. And then I saw you on Twitter, and I'm like, and like you said, we started going back and forth. I'm like, let's just talk about this because and we should put the big disclaimer on it. This is all about PR, right?
Yes.
This is not about what we think about. This is about the response and what's going on, the messaging.
Yes.
So we don't want any
Always
hatred flying at us about
yes,
this. Yeah,
exactly.
right. So everybody just right.
I'm so happy that you mentioned that because I have to add a disclaimer here. So we're talking about Alec Baldwin and Dave Chappelle, and I dipped my toe into Dave Chappelle on Twitter today because I've been following it for a while, as you have. And when you and I kind of went back and forth, like, okay, you have an opinion on it. And then I started watching more of what's happening. And I think it's a great topic for both of us to discuss. So as we put together this narrative for you and I to talk about. So thank you for mentioning my podcast, Confident Communications. And I'll drop right now that I'm rebranding next month in November. It's going to be the Indestructible PR podcast. It's just going to be all about, PR. And then your podcast as well, the PR podcast. And we talk about the same things. And as you mentioned, I did a story on Alec Baldwin from last Thursday. So should we talk about Alec first?
Go. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Why don't do you want to give the background?
Well,
as a New Yorker, as a fellow New Yorker.
Right, and a fellow Long Island.
Long Islander, yes.
Can you believe it, right?
Do you see Alec Baldwin around? Like, do you have any history with Alec Baldwin?
Oh, we hang all the time. No,
okay. I know you're not hanging with the brood on the beach, but Jody, you go back in New York with your PR days there. What do you have any interaction at all with Alec Baldwin?
I never crossed paths with Baldwin. No.
Okay.
The closest I ever got was, sadly, when I had to organize the public relations and the media response around James Gandolfini's funeral at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, which was my client. And Baldwin and his wife, I guess it was Hilaria, attended, right? And so it was sort of like, oh yeah, Baldwin's going to do his op over there kind of thing, but that's it.
Oh my God! See, now I wish you and I could just go on a little tangent.
Yeah, that's like
talk about the
thing, right?
I know the many saints of Newark. Just quickly,
yes,
did you watch it?
I have to watch. No, I have to watch it. Yeah.
Okay, I just watched it. It's leaving HBO Max soon.
Yeah.
Well, so was I. So that's a whole thing. Okay, but Alec Baldwin, you being a New Yorker, you know that he has a hot and cold relationship with the press.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean,
the New York Post frequently called him the bloviator, I believe.
Right?
Wasn't that his name? Okay, so why don't you give us a rundown on what happened with Alec?
I mean, short story. What looks to be a tragic, horrible accident that you cannot just comprehend on the set of his movie that's shooting out in, I think it's New Mexico, where we will say right now, accidentally, and I'm sure it was an accident, shot and killed somebody and injured a second person on the set. Horrible incident. At this point seems to be the result of someone not knowing that a gun was loaded with live ammunition versus blanks, which I just I can't comprehend why there's live ammunition on a movie set anyway, but that's besides the point. And so now there is what you and I have talked about, which is sort of the response to this and the messaging to this. And we're not here to talk about what might have happened or what did happen. We're here to talk about the response and from Baldwin, from the movie producers, he is one of the producers, from the studio, from law enforcement, who's doing what messaging where and how this all spools out.
Right. Yes. And the messaging, like, just like you on Thursday, when I heard about this, I have to hear this comment. Ascent Storycraft. Alec is a surprisingly nice guy. They let me pet their dog once in East Hampton.
Oh, okay. That's my friend Cindy. Okay,
that's Cindy? Okay,
yeah.
Good. Okay, Cindy has a 1 degree of separation with Alec Baldwin, his wife, and their dog.
And something I did not know about her.
Oh, wow. That's a good cocktail conversation. So here we go. So one thing that I will add about your response here is when the story happened, and as I mentioned in the podcast, my first hat on is reputation management, Alec Baldwin.
Yes.
You're right. So he's saying at Vox National, it's important to differentiate between the actor responsibility versus the producer responsibility. And that's absolutely true. So my first thought was, okay, Alec Baldwin has a crisis no matter what the reasoning for why it happened. And you knew it wasn't intentional. Like, just from the first notifications, you knew that Alec Baldwin was not, shooting someone intentionally. You knew that there was a human error, certainly involved. But it's Alec Baldwin's reputation. So when I sat down, I knew, okay, I'm doing a podcast on the Alec Baldwin response. So I started looking at his response immediately, like from my bed, like that, like looking at it, like what happened. So noticing first, putting the facts together of what happened. The set was in Albuquerque, was near Santa Fe, I believe. Yeah. And the crew, they had to stay in Albuquerque, or one or the other. And having just traveled there for work and having to do that drive, I know that's a significant drive. Yeah. You knew that there was going to be some blame going around, certainly. And that's what kind of spooled out from all of this. Like right now, before we start, with the response, we'll see where we are right now. A lot of the focus is on who held the gun when, who put the live round in. And this is just me off top of my head, not researching it, but just reading an article. It sounds like someone in the prop department was playing around with it the night before and doing shooting practice and maybe accidentally left a live round, in the gun. So horrible. So I think we both know that everyone understands that Alec Baldwin was not directly responsible for this, but has a responsibility, one, for the shooting itself, but also as a producer. So now there is the actor differentiation and the producer. Now, Jody, what did you notice? When was the first time you heard about this story? Like, how did you see it or read it?
Notifications that come across my phone.
Okay.
Horrible accident, blah, 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 Alec Baldwin.
Yeah, so on my podcast, I was watching in real time, like what was happening with Alec Baldwin. And so what I noticed is there was nothing. We just had the notifications that something tragic had happened on the set. I don't know, were you like me wondering how one bullet injured 2 people?
Oh, I was like the JFK conspiracy, like Seinfeld, the magic loogie and the whole thing. Like, how does that happen, and why? Who was pointing the gun? And again, we're not here to do that, but there's a little. And so in my brain, I'm going, okay, there's an order to this. There's an order to the messaging response of this, and one key component here that is going to take time to come out is the law enforcement response, the investigation. The initial what happened, the press conference that initially happens, and then there's an investigation, and then the results of that investigation, which are supposed to be bookends in terms of messaging, and typically don't come right on top of each other. There typically is a long period in between that. In media world, in the world that we live in, gets a vacuum that gets filled by a lot of other opinion and research and speculation and who saw what, when, and how. And so the faster that investigation bookend can show up, I think the better off everybody is going to be. And I think that's why Baldwin comes out very, very quickly within 24 hours. I'm cooperating fully. And I thought his response, it was 2 tweets on Twitter, I thought were very human and very smart. Again,
Yes,
from a
yes.
messaging standpoint,
Right.
I'm in touch with her husband, feel terribly, condolences sent out, and then the second tweet is, I'm cooperating fully, and we're going to get to the bottom of it. I thought that was very smart in terms of a messaging response from him.
Yeah, and I do think it was smart, but I also think that part of it he was kind of pushed into a PR response. If
I
you
would have
remember
pushed him.
oh, absolutely. But I
Yeah.
think it was the sheriffs had the first response. It was an official statement where they fingered Alec Baldwin. They said Alec Baldwin was the person behind the gun. So he's outed. So he has no choice at that point but to own it. That was the one thing that I noticed. Like, okay, they're pinning him for this incident. So that was the first statement that I saw and that I read. And then before the Alec Baldwin tweet, there was a very curious news story in Showbiz 411 that was picked up by the New York Post, by the tabloid. And so my brain is working in overtime thinking, okay, when is the last time that Alec Baldwin had a brush with notoriety or anything?
A
yes,
story,
okay.
right. My old client, the New York Post, by the way. Go ahead.
No kidding. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, bleed tabloid. Okay. I mean, we all have to read the New York Post, right? And the Daily Mail. But there was a story planted in the New York Post quoting Showbiz 411 that claimed an on-set bystander said that Alec Baldwin expressed remorse and said specifically, who gave me, I'm not saying it, directly from the quote, attributing the quote directly, but who gave me a hot gun? I'm never supposed to have a hot gun, right? So already right there, he is deflecting the blame right there. And he's also framing the story that it's an accident. So we know that. Mm-hmm. And that playbook, which I mentioned on my podcast, is straight out of the Ilaria Baldwin response to appropriating her Spanish roots when only her parents vacationed there. They did the same thing. They dropped stories in the press for the press to pick up. So that is Jody. So that goes back to your days, like what, 20 years ago, when people would drop. You have history with that, right? You just, what do you do? What would someone do if they had to drop a story without direct attribution? What would they do?
You give it to a friendly reporter who's going to report it your way. And it's all, off the record. And you point them in the direction you want to go.
Yeah. And then that's exactly it. So Vox National saying, Pablum. What was Pablum? Like his response? Uninformed internet sleuths creating a conspiracy theory fast. Oh my gosh, a la Gabby Petito, right? Then the headlines, Baldwin shoots. Yeah, exactly. So this was a rapidly, moving story. But I thought that was very curious that the Baldwin team, the PR team already said, okay, we have to frame this. He's already outed. We have to frame it as an accident and we have to go from there. And then the stories, started dripping out, from the set. We heard about the union issues that perhaps the union crew members were let go. They brought in amateurs or, non-union employees. And those were the people who allegedly are the ones that prepped the gun.
Right. Well, and that's what I mean when I was talking about sort of this vacuum that's getting filled, right? You've got, and again, we want to reemphasize, we're talking about the messaging and the PR response here. We're not talking about what we think happened or any conspiracies or anything. But you've got the initial response, you've got the law enforcement response, and then what will eventually happen is the official law enforcement response about their investigation and what they conclude actually happened. And that could come an hour from now, and that could come 2 weeks from now, right?
Right,
And so in the meantime, because this is such a sensational thing, you've got a lot of media who are looking to, and going back to that comment about uninformed internet sleuths, you've got a vacuum that is being filled by people who are calling and asking around and all kinds of conspiracy theories and everything that's coming out. And I think if anyone wants this to come to its conclusion as quickly as possible, it's probably Alec Baldwin.
Yeah, without a doubt. Now, what's interesting, so Vox National saying by Pablum, I was referring to the commentary after the story dropped, all the opinions. You're absolutely right. Yeah, and so both of you are right about the vacuum that's filled. And I did a podcast about the Gabby Petito case about how all the TikTokers and, you know, social media sleuths out there, they were reporting on the case as much, or working on the case as much, as law enforcement was working on the case.
Yeah.
So this social media movement can really move a story quickly. So it's almost as if you have to catch up with the momentum of what is happening online. And that's what Alec Baldwin was doing. Now, Jody, curious, I don't know if you saw this. So you mentioned the Alec Baldwin response, which I too thought was a very good response on the 22nd, where he discussed there's no words to convey my shock and sadness regarding the tragic accident. And then he also mentioned the family and all who knew and loved her, and that he is in touch with the family. I thought that was key, because he had to say the family did not turn against him, that he's with the family right now. Since then, Alec Baldwin just retweeted on the 23rd a story with the headline, Apple News, Alec Baldwin was told prop gun was safe before fatal shooting. So the framing is, Jody?
Yeah, it was Alec, right. It was, see, it wasn't my fault. He's trying to say that, yeah, it wasn't my fault. See, other people say it wasn't my fault. For sure. Did I lose you there? Hold on, do that again.
Someone, a colleague who I haven't spoken to in a year is calling me on Facebook audio. It's like all the timing. Oh my gosh. So let's talk about the best and worst and the weirdest part of the response with Alec Baldwin before we move to Dave Chappelle. So what do you think is the best part of the Alec Baldwin response?
Well, so far, I think we both agree that the best part is really his response. It was nearly immediate. It was quick, and it did the two things it needed to do. One, I'm in touch with the family. And two, I'm cooperating with the investigation, which is all he needed to say at that point, and then he can go away. And that's, you know, classic crisis strategy 101 is if you've got a crisis, low profile. Unless you need to get out there and push back against stuff and tell your story, which he's also doing a little bit, according to what, you know, the tweets that he's sent. But I think as an initial strategy, I think that was the best part, his initial response. And he probably wanted to his PR people probably just want to stick with that until the investigation is over.
I agree with you. So I'm in total agreement with his response. He owned it. He had to. He owned it right away. And also he chose to put it on Twitter, which I thought was the best place to do it, because that's where the conversations were absolutely happening.
And all that stuff is embeddable too. It goes into and we'll talk about Chappelle too. That goes into every article, right? Every article that gets read, there's a hyperlink back to that statement, which is
yes, it is considered an official statement. If you post on Twitter, that is an official media statement. Now, your friend Cindy, I think this is your friend Cindy, said Hutchins' father also said he does blame Alec. Oh, which
I think she meant to say doesn't.
Doesn't. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I agree with you on that. What about the worst part about the response?
Well, you know, I don't think it's Baldwin's response. I think the worst part about all this are all the hangers on. And the people who are jumping on this for their own political advantage. I mean, there are a group of people, let's put it this way, who have created shirts that say guns don't kill people, Alec Baldwin kills people.
No kidding. I haven't seen that. Okay.
And we're familiar with them from the last 4 years.
Yeah.
You know, it's those folks.
Right.
And that's just not it's just not appropriate. It's disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting. And so that I think is the worst of this right now.
Yeah, that's the worst part of it. If I were to pin the worst part of the Alec Baldwin response from the Alec Baldwin, I guess it was the detour of going to like Showbiz 411 and planting the stories in the New York Post. Like, I get that narrative and I get that playbook and why it happened. And there was certainly a time where that worked, where you worked in the milieu of, you know, New York City PR and crisis PR. But I thought that was a little disingenuous, a little too slick for the tragedy that it was.
Agree with you there. Yeah.
So what was the weirdest part about the whole Alec Baldwin story with you?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that one. I have a better one for Chappelle, but I'm trying to think
Okay.
about the weird one. I'm interested in what you think was the
Okay.
weirdest.
I have two. I have two. One, Ilaria speaking up and having a post in Instagram. I felt this was a time the world did not need to hear from Ilaria at all. That was a coattail statement that she did not need to make. And I have to admit, one of my first thoughts was Ilaria sitting there in Long Island with all the kiddos thinking, oh, he's absolutely ruined my reputation. Because really, now the stain is on hers as well. But also the weirdest one is,
You know what, I'm
yeah,
sorry, that brings up a reminder. We talked about Gandolfini's funeral before.
yeah,
She caught a lot of flack during, I just remembered this. In the
yes.
middle of the Gandolfini funeral, there was a tweet that went out from her handle about her, whatever it was, clothing line, cosmetics line, whatever. Like somebody didn't pause the Twitter feed, and it's in the middle
Oh,
of James Gandolfini's funeral. And it's obviously it's not her. I mean, maybe it is, who knows? But somebody didn't push pause on the Twitter feed. And she
oh,
caught, go back and search that. That's there. I'm sorry to digress, but
oh,
I just
no, but
remembered that.
that's a good
And
one
in
because
terms of
Jody,
like social media practice, you've got to be aware of the environment that you're working in, right? You've got to
yes,
be aware of what's going on around you. It's easy to get tunnel vision on what's right in front of you on your screen, or
yes.
what the regular course of business is. You got to read the room, man.
You
and
do have to
and
read the
and to
room.
your point, she was not reading the room.
She was not reading the room. One question that she never reads it properly. But in my podcast this week, which I published today about this tragedy, it was about how to create a 10-step crisis checklist, if you will, if you are involved in a tragedy and it's a tragedy at your own hands, and you can download my 10 steps. But one of the things that I mentioned in there is you need to pause all of your content and collateral that is coming out in at least the 2 weeks of that span of the tragedy. And that's where social media dashboards are helpful, because they have kill switches where you can turn that off. So yeah, that's definitely one weird part. And then the other weird part too, is I noticed when I was writing the outline for the podcast, is I went to Alec Baldwin's Wikipedia page and it was scrubbed. It
You
was
said
scrubbed.
that, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know when. I wish I would have gone to it the moment I heard about, the shooting, because I do that. I'm one of those people that do that. But by the time I got there the next morning to look at all, because I was trying to do the timeline of all the times he was in the press, like with Word with Friends and calling his daughter a thoughtless pig, it was all gone. It was scrubbed.
Wow, that's
Wow,
amazing.
wow, wow. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there's a
Okay, so
screenshot of it somewhere.
there is true. This is true. Okay, so let's move on to Dave Chappelle. You have opinions on Dave Chappelle.
This is, again, this is the messaging part, not the what he said or whether or not we
Mm-hmm.
agree or disagree, or we're not here to debate the content. We're talking about the response to it and how this story is spooling out from a messaging perspective.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I heard about the Netflix special. I wasn't particularly motivated to see it, even though I have watched Dave Chappelle in the past. I think he's an acquired taste. I think you either like him or you don't.
Yes.
I can find some of the things that he says are funny, and some of the things I'm like, not so much. But I view him through the lens of, look, he's a comedian. He's an artist. He's creating something, and you can like it or you cannot like it. I think in this case, he's stepping over the line into his social commentary, and he's sort of inviting this stuff. So to a degree, I think he's got to accept the premise. If he's going to say this stuff, he's got to accept the stuff that's going to come back at him. He's got to be aware of the stuff that's going to come back at him.
So I totally agree with you on Dave Chappelle. He is an acquired taste, and this is where I come at it with Dave Chappelle. I feel as if he's one of these brands, like a personality, who is given more reverence than is due just because he's Dave Chappelle. You know how there are just some people that they're considered iconic, and then they're always iconic, like like Richard Pryor. You always hear about comedians talking about Richard Pryor. Now, but Richard Pryor was funny, don't get me wrong, but they always harken back to Richard Pryor. And Dave Chappelle has the same type of reputation, and I've never gotten it, My lens, and granted, I'm a middle-aged white woman from the Midwest who lives outside of Boston right now. You know, I am not his target market at all. And my lens from him is Tom Hanks' sidekick and You Got Mail, you know, which, I mean, and he wasn't even funny in it, right? Like, he was just there. But what I find interesting about this is Dave Chappelle using the platform of stand-up in a show to make a statement. And today that he chose a clip from his set to put on Instagram, and he took a very biting clip. You know, it had sharp edges to it, certainly, but it was very intentional what he had to say. So if we were to do the best and worst and weirdest part of it, the best part that I'm going to give Dave Chappelle in all of this is, you know, he has an opinion. He has his agenda at play, but I like that he was smart enough, or someone on his team, to say, let's leverage your show, publicize the show, leverage social media to get your message out, put it in a 15-second clip, I believe, and then promote it. I thought that was genius.
I think the Instagram response to the controversy and him using, because you're starting to see this make the rounds in the last 24 hours. That clip where he's responding to the controversy, totally brilliant to you put on social media, just like you said, because again, going back to the Baldwin example with the Twitter and the public statement, that Instagram clip is inside of every single story that is online about this today and will live there forever. So in terms of getting a public statement out and responding, didn't put it in writing. Here's me saying exactly what I want to say. Regardless of what you and I think of how well he did it, and I think we have opinions on how well he actually delivered the message.
Yeah.
The use of social media in that way, 100% genius.
Yeah, 100% genius. Okay, so in this whole story then, what do we think is the worst part of it?
I think the worst part of it has actually been Netflix's initial response.
About, I agree.
Something about he was too popular to remove from the platform, or his show was too like that is a cop-out.
Yes.
It reminds me of what social media, specifically Facebook and Twitter, used to say about Donald Trump, when he would say things that were absolutely, you know, factually inaccurate and horrific and horrible, and they would say, well, he's the president of the United States, we can't take him off the platform. Well, you can if he's factually inaccurate. You can if he's inciting something. You can if he's actually doing something that he's not supposed to be doing and violating your terms of service. Yeah, you can take him off, and that's what you're supposed to do. So I think Netflix's initial response about too popular to remove was a real cop-out. They simply should have said, we're standing by it, or it's his art and we're putting it on there, or dude signed a contract, we're going to abide by the anything else.
Right.
Saying he's too popular to remove is really, I think, a cop-out.
I agree with you. It's really,
and that's where Chappelle says. That's where Chappelle says. You know, what did he say about how Netflix? Thank goodness for Netflix, they didn't cancel me or something like that.
Yes, exactly. So,
but he also talked about the corporate interest. That's what it was. The corporate interest.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yep. It was the shout out to Netflix, but I think, yeah, Netflix, they doubled down on it, which was wrong, especially as the transgender issue came out and Netflix had a walkout. An employee walkout, and an employee was fired. But I think it really is it's a Netflix leadership. Ted, what's his last name?
Sarandos.
Yes, it's his problem. And I guess where my brain went is I watched a interview when he was on the CBS morning show with Leslie Stahl a number of months ago, and it was an excellent interview, and it was right before Netflix really spiked during the pandemic, and they really had a handle on everything. It's almost like they were flying on the good faith and goodwill of everything. But now with all the streaming services out there, it's incredibly competitive. So he is under the gun, and I think it's about programming, right? Like that's really what it is. You have Hannah Gadsby on one hand, and you have Dave Chappelle. And now because of Netflix, you have your two artists like going against each other. So I guess that creates publicity but it doesn't make Netflix look good, in my opinion. It's their crisis.
Yeah, you know what? I haven't looked at their stock price lately, so I'd love to see that.
Oh, yeah, that would be interesting. That would be interesting. Okay, so we said the best and the worst. Is there any weird part of the Dave Chappelle Netflix story?
You know, I think the weird part for me is how people have, well, how polarizing this has been from the perspective of people really parsing every word that a comedian is saying. Now, I'm not defending anything that Dave Chappelle said. And I think and I am not a member of that community. I have friends who are in that community. And I believe that, you know, if you are truly offended by something that someone says and you take that personally, you have that right to be offended. Absolutely. And at the same time, I think to Chappelle's point that there may be an awful lot of people who are criticizing him without actually having watched the show, without actually watching what he said. And if you know anything about Dave Chappelle's stand-up, you know that he has a routine that he goes through his hour of comedy, and then his last 10 minutes or so are one of these sort of poignant real-world stories that are, you know, his brand of offensive and his brand of pushing the boundaries, but are also meant to make you, you know, scratch your head a little bit and go, wow, that's interesting. And so I would just urge anyone who's, I would want to have a factually based conversation, I guess, about it. Because I think there may be, to his point, a lot of people who are upset about this based on what they've read and not what they've seen.
Yes. And again, Vox National was saying, isn't the weirdest thing his demands is to speak to Netflix employees? When you watch his stand-up and his remarks for a moment, where he went a little off, and I absolutely agree with you. And as a comedian, you have a right to your own rhetoric, your own opinion, your own angle. I mean, it's your fan base, and you're gonna cater to it. But he came across very spiteful, and then he's making these demands on his viewers and on his fans. And I thought that was an area of just unnecessary, an unnecessary journey that he needed to take there, because I think he was fine. He was navigating it. He had his fans. He's the irreverent, you know, Dave Chappelle. But to go after Hannah Gadsby, which I thought was a little crass there, and it was totally unnecessary. And Hannah Gadsby's, and not saying that she's not funny, she's actually quite funny. She's quite brilliant. So that was a problem as well. And then just making these demands, it leaves a stain on him. And I had said this on Twitter, I think in reply to you, when people start to blame and attack, that's always a red flag to me of how they really feel. And I feel it's his confidence has been weakened by this. Like, he's shook by all of this publicity. So he's coming out, you know, fighting and kicking on all that. But that's my take on it.
Yeah, I think his that Instagram clip, I think, is as brilliant as we agree using it is to get his statement out. I do think he didn't execute very, very, very well, because I feel like he ended up in the same place he started in that clip, where, you know, defiantly flipping the microphone and be like, ugh. And if you want to build rapport and if you want to respond to something, that's definitely not the way to do it. Actually, I think the best response in this whole thing was Hannah Gadsby's response to Netflix.
Yes.
Where she said something like, I definitely didn't cross a line, because pointing at Netflix, because you just told the world there isn't one, which I think is a brilliant line. And terrifically effective from a messaging standpoint.
Absolutely.
That was really good.
Yeah, so she comes out as a winner, right? People who have never heard of Hannah Gadsby now are going to hear of Hannah Gadsby.
Yeah. And I'm going home to watch Hannah Gadsby. I've never seen her before, and I honestly, you know, she was off my radar. I'm going to go check out Hannah Gadsby now.
I saw her special. It was a while ago, her last special, and they said it was her last tour. I think you're going to like her, Jody. I think her humor will be right up your alley.
I like everybody.
You do. Being a New Yorker, surprising. New Yorkers are not supposed to like everybody. Minnesotans are. That's what we do.
Oh,
Minnesota nice. Minnesota nice. Okay, anything to wrap up, Jody? We did it. We accomplished our dual conversation about Alec Baldwin and Dave Chappelle on Netflix.
This has been great. I think, you know, the takeaway for me is that this cancel culture is just not productive. It's really not. You know, I know that, you know, we live in this world, and especially in the last 4 years, not a political statement here, but the world has become so polarized in the last 4 years that everything is a fight. everything is a problem. Everything is and it's like, it's bad enough that, if you have little kids at home, like the bowl isn't the right color for breakfast. We don't need to be canceling everybody. We need to be communicating with each other. And that was the point of you and I getting on here too, is to talk about communication, to talk about how you communicate your messages effectively and how you get across information to other people. There are certain sins that, yes, deserve canceling, but they're very rare. They're very rare. And I think this whole cancel culture is just not a productive thing. I think we need to be sharing information and transmitting, how we feel to each other to produce something.
Is it possible that you and I have two opposing views on the cancel culture?
Go for it.
It may sound like it. I am a proponent of a culture that holds people accountable.
Oh, agreed.
Yeah, and I know you agree how we come at it. I am a proponent of a culture where there is consequence for actions that deserve it. Where I think people get all mucked up is how we define it. And some people view the definition of cancel culture, they come at it differently. Some people look at it purely as a random mob of people that disingenuinely mean, spiteful, want to just bring a person down. I feel that the cancel culture is more of a ecosystem now, that people feel that they had, due to social media, that they now have the means to be heard, especially marginalized groups. And when people need to be held accountable for something, they are in a very public fashion. So that aspect of it, I'm a big proponent of it. But how you describe it and come at it, I agree with you as well. But it's just, what's the definition of cancel culture? Correct?
That's a perfect place to end this conversation. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I agree with accountability. Absolutely. I think you're totally right that, people jump on this cancel culture bandwagon simply because, their definition of what it should be doesn't match someone else's definition. And so it should be canceled.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Well, speaking of, you and I are not going to be canceled because we're going to come back. So the next time that there is a hot to trot story, you and I are going to come back and we're going to discuss it on Instagram Live.
I love it. This has been my first Instagram Live. I'm so inspired. This is great.
Well, I'm so happy that you were able to join me. This was fun. So we'll do it again, Jody, okay?
You got it, Molly.
Stay warm in the nor'easter.
Same. Use your umbrella and your galoshes.
My galoshes. All right. We'll talk to you later. Have fun in the wicked storm. All righty. Bye, Jody.